Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am Matt Ewalt, Director of Events and Live Journalism for the Texas Tribune. Thank you for joining us online and in person here in Austin at the Tribune Studio 919 for the screening of our panel conversation titled Adapting to a Hotter Texas, examining how our communities can work to prevent the most dangerous effects of extreme heat. Our program features a pre-recorded conversation with our panel and will be followed by a live Q&A with two Texas Tribune journalists from our Energy, Environment, and Immigration team. Our panel, moderated by the Tribune's climate reporter, Erin Douglas, was recorded over Zoom on July 27th so that we could engage in conversation voices from around the state in regions experiencing some of the worst of extreme heat, including the Gulf Coast, lower RGV, and far west. Our panel includes Nicole Alderete-Ferrini, Climate and Sustainability Officer for the City of El Paso, Dr. Iván Meléndez, the Health Authority for Hidalgo County, and Stefania Tomaskovic, Coalition Director for the Houston-based Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. I want to thank today's sponsors. Our major sponsor is Texas State Technical College. Our foundation sponsors are Emerson Collective and the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. Our reader-supported newsroom of talented, empathetic journalists delivers wide-ranging stories about how Texans are navigating the heat and what climate change has to do with it. Help us tell even more stories. Join as a Tribune member with a donation of any amount. Give at texastribune.org/donate. Every donation counts and directly supports our independent reporting and free events like this. And if you're already a member, thank you for your continued support. The Texas Tribune Festival is happening in downtown Austin this fall, September 21st to 23rd. Hear from a growing list of leaders and innovators shaping the future, including Adam Kinzinger, Renu Couture, Catherine Clark, Aaron Franklin, and many others. And as related to our conversation today, at TribFest we'll also welcome Andrew Dressler, Director of the Texas Center for Climate Studies at Texas A&M University, and Doug Lewin, President of Stoic Energy. Learn more at tribfest.org. Now some housekeeping notes about today's program. Our panel conversation, recorded on Thursday, July 27th, runs approximately 50 minutes, which will follow with 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A with two journalists on our climate and environment team, our moderator and the Tribune's climate reporter, Erin Douglas, and Dave Harmon, our environment, energy, and immigration editor. And while Erin and Dave will be able to speak to the Tribune's reporting on these issues in Texas and may be able to reference resources for additional information, if they aren't able to answer the question, they're going to point us in the right direction. Thank you for joining us, and let's get to the panel conversation, Adapting to a Hotter Texas, and our moderator, Erin Douglas.
Thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation by the Texas Tribune, Adapting to a Hotter Texas. Welcome to our panelists. I'm going to introduce each of you, and I'm so excited for all three of you to join us today. So we have Dr. Iván Meléndez. He is the Health Authority of Hidalgo County. Dr. Meléndez is a hospital-based physician practicing emergency medicine and serves as the Health Authority for Hidalgo County. He is trained as a family physician and has served the Rio Grande regional area for the last 20 years. We also have Stefania Tomaskovic. She is the Coalition Director for the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. Prior to joining CEER, she worked with Public Citizen, a national nonprofit group dedicated to representing the people's voice in the halls of power. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we also have Nicole Alderete-Ferrini. She is the Climate and Sustainability Officer for the City of El Paso. In 2014, Nicole became the first Latina in the world to serve as the Chief Resilience Officer for municipal government. And most recently, following 6 years at the helm of the Department of Community and Human Development, Nicole is serving as the Climate and Sustainability Officer for the City of El Paso. So thank you to all three of you for being here today. We really appreciate it. And just, this conversation about extreme heat, we've had this deadly extreme heat wave pushing through Texas this summer, the same month that the Earth, like the whole globe, marked its hottest day on record. We know from our reporting at the Texas Tribune that thousands of Texans have been treated and rushed to emergency departments across the state for heat-related illnesses. At least 9 people in South Texas have died from the heat, and more deaths I'm seeing reported across the state this summer as well. And these heat waves and the record-breaking temperatures they bring, they're becoming more and more common and severe due to climate change. So this is a very important time, I think, to have this conversation and to hear from, folks all over the state and working in these communities. So I'd like to kind of start with some of the impacts of the extreme heat wave on everyday people and some of the problems that we're really seeing in our communities. And I know, Dr. Meléndez, you mentioned that you've been in the hospitals and in the emergency departments experiencing some of the real impacts of this. And, would you speak a little bit to and describe what you're seeing in Hidalgo County?
Yeah, absolutely. You well stated. This has been the hottest day the world has ever seen, right in the middle of one of the biggest heat exhaustion and heat fatalities that we've had in memory. Last year, in the entire year in Texas, we had approximately 305 people die from heat-related or heat direct sources. This year, in beginning of July, we're already up to 273. It's my understanding, I've been out from Texas for a week, that we're up to 279. So we know that this is going to be a banter break year, not only for it being the hottest ever, and in fact, understanding that the last 10 years have set almost annual records. There have been over 1,000 days in the last decade that have set increased or Texas record temperatures. So no one can argue that we're hotter than we've ever been, and no one can argue that every year it's getting hotter. And we've seen directly in the very southern tip of Texas in Hidalgo County, where we are 6 miles away from gang violence from the cartels, immense poverty from our partners in the south, and where our citizens are the poorest in the nation, the most obese, the most diabetic, and most hypertensive. And as you know, that heat exposure, heat tolerance, warmer and world and climate increase affects disproportionately people who are poor and people that do not have access to other resources, including the sequela of what we've seen from the previous years and lending practices to people that are brown and of colored. And so we see our people have been living in these homes without air conditioning, without mandates to provide air conditioning by landlords, with the governor 2 weeks ago unbelievably removing the rest and from heat to workers. That law was removed by his signature. So we're seeing a politically unfavorable environment for our folks down in South Texas, who I believe have been exposed more so than other people because of lack of air conditioning, lack of able to afford electricity. And quite frankly, I think that we could have done a much better planning, such as the City of Laredo and perhaps El Paso, in dealing with the heat that's coming. So what are we seeing? We're seeing an overall 10% increase of people in the emergency department since June with heat and heat-related causes. We're seeing increases in death, increases in visits. And let's not forget that not only is it heat exhaustion and heat intolerance that impacts deaths, but also those diseases that are predisposed so that a person cannot acclimate or respond to these extreme heats, such as diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, obesity, poverty, all those things that are impacting us directly. And so when I flew helicopters in Iraq 10 years ago, people were used to 115, 120 degrees weather. Down in South Texas, we are not. And so people have not acclimated, and because of their predisposed disposition, they aren't able to respond as, say, someone might in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I'd like to go to Nicole and hear about some of the impacts in El Paso, because you all have had more than 30 days of over 100-degree temperatures there, and I'm sure your communities are feeling the impact of that. And so, what are you hearing from the health experts in your community? How is your community responding to this heat, and what are some of the challenges that El Paso is facing during this time?
So I think Iván said it very, very well. I mean, we're talking about dealing with disproportionate impact to the populations that we're trying to serve. And we're seeing some of the most extreme weather. You mentioned it's now, I think, just over 40 days of triple digits here in El Paso. I think previous to that, the average was 15, right? And so it's not just about sort of having this, record-breaking heat, but it's also about how long it is lasting and how it's not cooling off at night. And so there's no reprieve from that. We're not only seeing, I think, physical health impacts, as Iván very eloquently described, as sort of compounding to pre-existing conditions that we see in our community very regularly, but we're also seeing a mental health impact, right? Folks feeling very, very distressed. And the more vulnerable you are, the more distressed I think that you are subject to being, right? So if we start talking about not just folks that are in their homes and are having difficulty managing heat, but those folks that don't have homes, right? Those folks that are out on the street and trying to manage this and really just, frankly, being in a living hell in that space. We also look at the impact on because we are also a border community, the impact that we're seeing with our sister city, Ciudad Juarez, right across the bridge, and also with the migrant population that is unhoused. And so there's just a tremendous pressure on particularly city government to respond to that. So what are some of the things we do? I think there's some of the things you hear across the country. We set up cooling centers. We have an extreme weather task force that will go and respond to extremely low and low income households that need access to air conditioning, temporary air conditioning, fans, whatever that is. We have another program that we run here in El Paso, the Retired Senior Volunteer Program, because we know seniors are even more vulnerable to the heat than other populations. And so we have programs where we just go check on those folks, just making sure, are they okay? Do they need a ride to a cooling center? How are we responding to that? And sort of just being there for each other. And I hate to overuse the phrase, but one of I think the very powerful things about El Paso, and what we saw with the birth of El Paso Strong in 2019, was that El Pasoans will come together for each other. And that's where we're seeing, I think, a lot of caring and a lot of sort of familial support during this time. But I think the problem is, without going on too far or getting ahead of the conversation, is that we're simply reacting to the heat. And I think that it's always interesting to me as a climate officer, as someone who's worked in the field of resilience for a little over a decade, and saying, why are we surprised? I think that crisis should be defined by something that is unexpected. This is not unexpected. We know that this is related to climate change. There is science behind it. There are things that we can do to mitigate what's going on in the future. So as robust as our response can be, our responsibility at this time is to start to mitigate that heat for the future.
Yeah. And Stefania, I know you're in Houston, working with a different community. What sort of patterns are you seeing in the heat and how it's affecting the folks you're working with, and maybe also tell us a little bit about the Coalition for Environment Equity and Resilience.
Yeah, so the Coalition for Environment Equity and Resilience, we were founded after Hurricane Harvey because that event had just such a traumatic impact on our community and really harmed our environment, as well as, displaced people. There are people who are still recovering from Harvey. And I think that's an important thing to remember in Houston, that there is a large number of housing stock where the homes are not, they're in disrepair. They really lack what's needed to protect people from extreme weather, including the extreme heat that's happening right now, as well as the extreme cold that happened in 2021 during Winter Storm Uri. Mm-hmm. And so people in a lot of the neighborhoods where we're working, primarily in Northeast Houston, people still feel incredibly vulnerable to the elements. And part of what we advocate for, so we work on climate justice and health and bringing those aspects together through our climate justice campaign. And we're advocating for more robust home weatherization programs to really protect the people who are most vulnerable, the elderly people, the disabled population, to really protect people who are at lower levels of income. And like Dr. Iván was talking about, people there's a lot of people who don't have access to affordable energy. There's a huge energy burden in the community. And so some of the needs that we've seen is, first off, there are people who lack air conditioners that work, and it is not required for landlords to ensure that a working air conditioner is in place in rental homes, rental properties. And so that's one issue right there, right? Even if people do have air conditioners, it's not guaranteed that they will be effective because homes are not well insulated, or that they can afford the energy that's required to run the air conditioning units. So all of those are big factors into how protected people are within their own homes. So we're having a lot of conversation with the communities that we're working in. And something else that's coming up right now in terms of some of the health impacts, one of the residents that we've been working with, she's reporting to us that she has been feeling sick for weeks. And she really thinks that this hot weather and plus the pollution on Houston's east side, she's in an East End neighborhood, that she feels like these are contributing to an even worse outcome for her respiratory health. So that's another consideration that we're looking at, is how pollution and climate change really interact and even worsen the impact on people's health.
For sure. And, going back to what Nicole was saying about planning and a little bit what you're saying, Stefania, about, homes being weatherized or lacking AC, it's interesting because I think that when we think about natural disasters, there's usually some sort of federal money that we can get, that city governments and counties can get after a natural disaster happens, like after Hurricane Harvey, for example, right? But with this sort of heat disaster, it's almost like a chronic event, and there's no real like property damage that's happening. I'm struggling to think of ways that city governments, counties can actually unlock some resources to try to help people during an extreme heat event like this. And so I'd be really interested to hear, from Nicole, Dr. Meléndez, all three of you about, what are some creative ways that we can think of to get more resources to communities during a more chronic emergency like this, and maybe the problems with the way that the system is kind of structured at this moment.
Yes, I think from my go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Meléndez.
From the medical perspective,
go
I think all of us bring a special expertise to this topic from our experiences and what we do. From the medical perspective, a quick reminder, one is Nicole is absolutely correct. We see a dramatic increase in behavioral health and emotional issues during these hot weathers. We have had a dramatic increase in violent, aggressive crimes, suicide, homicides at home. We had someone who assassinated someone because they were a Mason. And there's no question that depression, bipolar disease, schizophrenia, and psychotic episodes notably increase with these temperatures. And in reference to our other panelists, studies have shown time and time again that the particles of pollution that are in the air, and these studies were done both in Mexico City as well as Tokyo, probably two of the most polluted cities in the world, that these particular particles that are embedded in the air dramatically increase the effect and toxicity as the heat is bounced off these and magnified, such as it is on asphalt. And thus, that is why there's such a tremendous move to paint asphalt and buildings with reflective paints to avoid this particular phenomenon that pollution itself creates. From a medical perspective, which is my, area of expertise on the panel, and in reference specifically to the question that you asked, which is, what are the creative ways? In other words, we all know the problem exists, and we can talk from here till we all like to talk. That's why we're panelists. But the real issue that I applaud you is that, okay, so what's the solution? Right? What can we do to make a problem that's there? From a medical perspective, I like to break it up into two aspects. The victim, which is of course the person, and the cause of it, the causative agent. From the what we can do from a victim perspective is much more limited to what we can do from the environmental perspective. From the victim perspective, there's two things that we can do, which is prevention and treatment. With prevention, we need to find more creative ways to able to educate people exactly how to maneuver through these times. The main issues that people that are listening need to remember are twofold. One, acclimate, and understand what your underlying baseline state of health is. And then number two, avoidance, keeping away from it. So if you are a person who is not used to living in hot weather, it's going to take you much longer, days to weeks longer, than those populations that are already living in those areas. The body needs time to acclimate. This doesn't occur in a day or 2 days or a week. That's why athletes move to those particular areas where they're going to compete so they can acclimate either to the heat or to even cold. As for every person that dies from heat, interestingly, 9 people die from cold. So both extremes are bad. We're just having to be living right now the heat part. So one is understand about acclimation, how to do it. Number two, it's obvious. If you understand the number one lesson we learned with COVID and public health, number one lesson is we have to be in the best state of health. Those resources have to be placed on teaching people how to be non-obese, control diabetic, control hypertension, being diagnosed as having these diseases, and having programs, whether it's through atypical programs like HUD or city government, the way El Paso and other areas have done for areas of cooling and areas of planting of trees and painting of streets. But educating people, you don't want to be out between 11 and 3, and between 3 and 6 is the worst time. 2, know your underlying condition, avoid being outside if you don't have to. And we need to go back again and force our elected leaders, the legislative people, such things as removing the mandated breaks because of heat and water that was done 10 days ago. It is, to me, unfathomable that someone at this point in time would even consider removing, these mandated breaks for people that are in a record band year in heat and depth. So we need to address those people that make policy, to have them to understand the financial impact, if that's what they're focused on, and let's not forget the human impact of having some type of protection for our workers. So for human beings, understanding that evaporation is the way we cool our bodies. So the more humidity there is, the less gradient there is for water to leave your body. Number two, understanding that your kidneys, your lungs, your heart are going to be working a lot harder, because cooling off is hard work for the body. And so a lot of people will die from a heart attack, from insufficiencies, from strokes, because their bodies are asked to work so hard. In reference to the other part, that is the part of global warming and the part of what we can do from a medical perspective to help our community. I just got back from Antarctica 2 months ago. Let me tell you, even a diehard person like myself who believe that maybe there isn't global warming, there is no doubt that the world it's burning up all over. Even in Antarctica, you're seeing record being done. So what can we do about our environment from a medical perspective? Number one, make sure that public spaces are available. Make sure that we have cooling stations, electrolytes that are available, and also educating our practitioners, and making sure that the emergency departments, the primary care providers, the school districts, the senior citizen homes understand recognition of those people at high risk and early recognition of those people that are in trouble, because there's a direct relationship with survivability and problems with sequela from heat exhaustion or heat stroke the earlier it's recognized. And I think from a more creative and medical perspective, those would be, I think, the observations or the recommendations that I would make at this point.
Sure. And yeah, I would love to hear Nicole's perspective working in city government.
Yeah. I think that I want to actually tag on to something that Iván said just a moment ago in terms of, what can and should government be doing. I think one of the biggest problems we have is not identifying what potential solutions can or should be implemented, but it's rather pushing past the politics that are preventing those things from being implemented. And largely the challenge is this argument about, why is it happening? I believe in climate change. I don't believe in climate change. I will say that on a personal level, I've been involved in environment for my entire professional career, which, spans a couple of, oh my goodness, it's been 3 decades now. Yikes. I just dated myself. But I think that.
Welcome to 4.
Yeah. I do believe that it's happening. But if I'm speaking to someone who doesn't, that doesn't matter. I think at this point in time, what we need to be talking about is the fact that this is happening. No one can deny that. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do at the governmental level to start to understand that this is affecting human health. It's affecting business. Resilience is never about a singular issue. And if you try to build, resilience is about a system. If you try to build success or outcomes, positive outcomes in one area, that is the only area you're going to see that effect happen. You need to really start to connect. And so at the federal level, we need to start to tap into the agency resources across the board, whether we're talking about housing and urban development. This is not an EPA problem, right? This is a DOE problem. You know, this is a EPA, this is EDA, right? And the economic, I talk in acronyms sometimes, and I don't know if everyone in the audience knows what I'm talking about. Housing and Urban Development, Economic Development Association, Health and Human Services. I mean, we're here talking about the health impacts. Why are we not at the federal level really creating a robust cross-section of resources for communities to be able to access solutions, right? And deploy what's right in each of our communities. I think that's the first thing. So greater coordination, collaboration. We're seeing a little bit of that, I think, with FEMA. I know that FEMA is starting to do some work in resilience and starting to try to create that, but it becomes this, we have to implement that solution in a 4-year cycle because that's the election cycle and that's how far we have to be able to implement, right? And so I think we need to be able to get past that hurdle. This is not a challenge that you solve in an election cycle. And so it has to be something that we're looking strategically, long-term, and that we can be bipartisan in terms of what those solutions are. That then brings it back to the state level. I have been in government now just a little over a decade, always in Texas. And that conversation is difficult to have. But when we start to talk about how are we supporting the electric grid, what are we doing in terms of making sure that affordability stays a priority as we convert to renewables, as we create that reliability on the grid. Affordability and reliability is super important. One of the things we deal with in El Paso, we started talking about this, and I'm sure in some of the more humid areas, you've already had this conversation. But for years and years in El Paso, swamp coolers were enough. It was fine. But right. Not only do we have water conservation problems, right? So we need to understand that cross section, but swamp coolers aren't cutting it anymore. They are not right. Cooling our homes in the way that they need to, that's effective, particularly for those vulnerable populations. And then again, can people afford to turn them on? So we've had this conversation about, well, what if we created a program to convert everyone to refrigerated air? Oh my goodness. I mean, I even think for, low to mid-income families, that's intimidating because those electric bills are very high. So we've got to put affordability in front of this conversation, and we can't let those stand as a barrier to not doing something. We've got to be able to come back and take a look at that and force our utilities to be able to have that conversation. I'm very lucky in El Paso. We have a good relationship with El Paso Electric, and we're having that conversation, but we still haven't made enough progress. And so again, bottom line, federal, cross-sector, cross-agency support, outcomes that are focused in what is really affecting people. Those should be the outcomes we're measuring, right? It's not about how many new solar panels you put out or how many refrigerated air units you put out. It's how many people's lives did you save? And really measuring that from a social perspective, a health perspective. And then coming in at the state level and focusing in on infrastructure and what do we need from the state as cities to be able to support what we're really, frankly, is not an option for us anymore in terms of providing for our communities. And that's really where we are. The last thing I will say at a local level is that I am pretty certain that we're the only city in Texas right now that in my department, I oversee both climate and sustainability and community and human development. Community and human development is focused on vulnerability, homelessness, housing, poverty, mental and medical health, et cetera. And so you've got this sort of cross sector of what's happening with climate and what's happening in community. That is not an accident. That's not something that, oh, well, we'll give it to her. She can do it. No. Mm-hmm. There was a very intentional cross section there because we understand that climate is a community problem.
Yeah. And, thinking about some of these problems like the swamp cooler problem is like we sort of have the built environment, right, that we've designed all of our cities and our communities and all of these spaces within a very narrow range of temperatures, right? And even what Stefania was talking about earlier with the compounding disasters where you had a hurricane hit Houston, and then the housing stock was damaged, and people are still recovering from that, years later. And then that is making the heat a harder problem for them. And so, Stefania, I would love to hear your thoughts, on this topic as well, in terms of what are some of the more creative solutions that we can look towards in our communities, especially from like a ground up level, because we know the government solutions take time, and that sort of collaboration and cross-department collaboration and federal to state to local collaboration is a challenge. And so, what can we do just within our communities with different organizations, and what kind of new collaborations or solutions have you all been pursuing as this problem worsens?
That's a really great question, Erin. And I do want to say something in response to Nicole's comment, just really briefly, in that I think this integration of resilience, climate sustainability, and human impacts is incredibly important. And with that, investing into the communities that have the greatest need, the greatest vulnerabilities, in order to bring them up to be able to weather these storms, weather this chronic heat, weather these challenges that come up. I think that is a really important thing for every city and actually every level of government to be doing. And I think also it's part of that is making sure that cities and organizations like ours and community leaders are all in collaboration and in conversation, so that cities and other levels of government can really be addressing the needs as they are and not as they think they are. So that's one of the things that I think is really important. And with that, we're actually part of a pilot program from the Department of Energy with a partner of ours, the Houston Advanced Research Center. And one of the things that we are looking at, like I mentioned, home weatherization is a priority for us. And we'd like to find ways that we can make home weatherization programs more accessible to people, to help provide support along the application process, and to find ways so that people who apply, if they have some home repairs that need to be done prior to weatherization, that they don't just get dropped off the list, that they can actually have some of those repairs done in concert with the weatherization, so that their homes are improved, their energy bills are lessened, and that they can have a greater resilience in their own home. So that's something that we're looking at, is finding collaborations with some of our other local partners, with other entities like the Department of Energy, City of Houston. We're also working with Harris County in the development of really planning around climate change and some of these health impacts, and really sitting down and figuring out how we can begin to mitigate those health impacts, how we can bring additional resources in through some of the federal funding opportunities that are happening, and really engage community in the process, because it's not just a government issue. This is something that people need to be talking about with each other. That's one of the ways that information gets spread, right? These conversations of, oh yeah, this is happening to me, and we're experiencing high heat, and this is some of the solutions. There's cooling centers, and on that note, cooling centers do need to be made accessible to the elderly as well as to the unhoused population, because they are suffering right now. Yeah. And I think the other thing that I do want to say is our approach has been, when CEER first started, we were really focused on some long-term policy goals, which I think are really important. But sometimes policy work takes a long time. And some of the community members we were working with got really frustrated by this approach and said, we have needs right now. So what can we do to begin to address those needs? And so one of the things that we did this year, we released a report on heat stress at the end of May to begin to inform community about the risk of heat and provide some solutions to them, things that they can do right now, and also some of the things we're working on in the long term. We also, with that, did air conditioner and fan distribution to community members. But I also want to emphasize that is not a long-term solution.
Yeah.
Air
Right.
conditioning is something that contributes to climate change. And I feel like we need to be, really thinking about the root of the problem as well. And so balancing the short-term needs and helping to prevent suffering right now, while also really thinking about strategies to address the climate crisis in the long term, is critical.
Yeah. And it's interesting thinking about the different types of solutions that you kind of think of city governments traditionally deploying when there's a heat wave. The cooling centers, I've seen a couple governments giving out fans, although I even read recently that a fan for somebody who's experiencing heat exhaustion or heat stroke is like not all that helpful.
Right.
You're just like blowing more hot air onto them, right?
Hot air. Correct.
So I mean, I'm curious what your all's thoughts are in terms of like solutions that maybe we need to move away from or adapt. And those are just two examples that I think there might be some problems in terms of, for cooling centers, people don't automatically just show up at a cooling center. It's not part of their normal commute or their normal day-to-day. So, how are you thinking about that, Nicole?
So a couple of things there. I'll answer your question first, and then I'm going to kind of back into the conversation a little bit. But I think, especially in a community where oftentimes you have folks that are have a level of fear of engaging with any kind of assistance, for fear of law enforcement, for fear of deportation, etc. You're not going to see those folks walk into a cooling center because there's fear. And so those folks are even at increased risk. And so that's something that we also have to consider. But I think that the main challenge, and this goes back to what Stefania was saying in terms of short-term and long-term solutions, there's two problems here. Number one, I said it at the top of the call, we are constantly in reaction mode, right? We're reacting to heat. Well, this should not be a surprise to anyone that it's hotter than it has ever been. These are things that we know. And so we've got to start to implement resources, funding, and policy that can mitigate prior to the crisis, right? And so what's happening right now, particularly in government, is you're seeing millions and millions of dollars pour into emergency response. And clearly that's required. Folks are suffering. We've got to deal with that right now. But what we're not investing in is the long-term solutions. And even more so at that point, what we're seeing at the federal level, and I have to be a little bit careful here, not to overstep my role, but what I will tell you is that, we have a Congress that is not passing policy, right? We're constantly, arguing about appropriation or budget, and that's important. Money is good. And I've said this to our delegation, money is great, right? The money that's coming in with IRA to do some of this work is great. Mm-hmm. I need policy that I can count on for a decade or more, right? And so balancing that short-term response and the long-term solution requires a level of policy making that's not happening right now. The other thing that I would suggest, again, going into the state level, is that every city is going to grapple with this in its own way. We were even just talking prior to the call of the differences. Yes, it's hot in both Houston and El Paso and in the RGV, but at the end of the day, our challenges are just a little bit different, right? We're dealing with things in a different way. And right now, the state of Texas makes it very difficult for municipalities to deploy solutions that we think are right for our community. And so that gets into a little bit of a more sticky conversation about local control. But I think that it's important that the state recognize that cities are on the front line, we're on the ground, we understand our communities, and we understand how to deploy resources, and we don't need to be micromanaged at that level. So I think those are some things that could help us address long-term solutions while our first responders continue to do the phenomenal job that they have always done.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And
I really feel I need to, Nicole.
Yes, sir. Yes, Iván. Tell me.
Let me tell you. So one of the reasons I ran for Congress was because of our elected officials not recognizing long-term plans and not having any other criteria except what's best for the community. And found that the political arena is far from maturing to the point where they make real decisions that are courageous themselves. The idea of the micromanagement and one size fits all turned out to be deadly for the Rio Grande Valley as well as El Paso. There are a lot of unnecessary deaths that occurred in both of our communities because one size fits all, whether it's you're dealing with an antibiotic that kills everything or a specific antibiotic for one disease, or whether you're dealing with addressing alcohol addiction, tobacco addiction, or heat or COVID. And so I have very little confidence that with our current political climate, that we will be able to micromanage based on our population density, on our pollution indicators, on our baseline state of health, on the resources of that community, both socioeconomic and cultural. I don't think that's going to happen. I think in an ideal world and in an obvious world, of course, that should be the baseline. And thus, in the environment that we're dealing with now, those of us that are involved in public health and in helping our community at large, it's a tough road to travel because it falls on deaf ears. And so what I have seen that I think is, I don't know, maybe more pragmatic are these emphasis on things that work everywhere. Because I think we're going to be faced with things that have to work everywhere. And everyone knows that is planting as many trees as possible because these are sustainable in the long term. We know that in 2050, all our panelists, most of the people listening to us will be alive in 2050. Maybe I'll be 90, so maybe not. But in 2050, we'll have an additional month of temperature above 90 degrees in Texas. So we know that in a couple of decades, this is going to be magnified even more, just as we knew 20 years ago, we're going to be where we are today. So you're right. It's not a surprise where we are. It's not a surprise how we got here. And it's certainly not a surprise where we're going to be. So these recommendations, I believe, that we need to address with the current political climate are those things that are going to have a long-term effect, such as tree planting, population density controls, building permits that must meet certain standards, providing those resources so all the communities can paint with the graphic reflective paints, roofs, and asphalt the way they do in Europe. And I think those, based on our climate, are probably more pragmatic things that we can get done right away with both a short-term and, of course, a long-term impact. And from a medical perspective, I'll leave you with this, is that once we hit 108 degrees, our bodies, we're not acclimated to do that. And once we're at 120 degrees, we have about 4 hours of survivability. I've been in Bradley fighting vehicles where it's 132 degrees because the air conditioners don't work. You can't be there more than 7 or 8 minutes. You have to constantly come out. 5,000 years ago, we had the options during the latter part of the last age to move as people did. Things would turn to deserts. We would move to the east, and thus we created the environment along the Nile River. 1 million people between the Mediterranean and down to Sudan. Unfortunately, those changes that human beings, Homo sapiens, have always been able to do, migration, movement because of climatology, guess what? We don't have that option anymore. With 8 billion people, soon to be 9 billion people, this is our planet. We're stuck on it. There's no place to go, although maybe Amarillo would be probably the best place in Texas for heat. And by the way, the best state would be Michigan, but there's no place to move. And so we have to remind people that we don't have any more options to tomorrow or going somewhere else. And that would be my point.
Yeah.
I have to add to that. I'm so sorry. I have to add to that because I think a couple of things. The first thing is in terms of shade, one of the things that we're looking into right now, we've got some additional dollars from the EPA in El Paso right now to commence our very first climate action plan at a regional scale. And so the climate action plan that we're working right now will be El Paso County and Hudspeth County, which is a gigantic geography of West Texas. And so we're going to start to look at that. And I think that's an important piece. But part of what we're looking at there, and I only have anecdotal information right now, but I hope to really dig into this. We're actually seeing that some of the coolest spots in El Paso, Texas are not the most shaded. The coolest spots in El Paso, Texas are those that abut natural desert open space. They are not shaded, but Mother Nature knows how to deal with this. We do not. And so one of the things that I'm very excited to explore as part of our climate action planning is how can the expansion of the preservation of natural desert space that understands how to mitigate heat help us not only create a higher quality of life in an urban desert environment, but also start to grapple with the heat issue as well as our water issue. And so there's a couple of things there that we're unpacking right now, but we've never had that conversation before because, and Iván, I agree with you to a certain extent, but it's largely because there's been this one size fits all sort of approach to this is how you deal with X issue. And I'm just not sure that we're there yet. So that's one thing. And then the other piece that I want to say in terms of the EPA initiative that we're doing right now, it's called climate pollution reduction. 67 of the biggest MSAs in the United States were awarded funds to be able to embark on this work at that regional scale. But the reason I bring it up right now is that it's got attached to it requirements under what they call the Justice 40 provision. Justice 40 is a provision on that funding that says we have to identify outcomes for the most vulnerable folks in our community. And they're leaving it really to communities to define what that means and how to report that. But what I'm excited about is for the first time under Justice 40, I am able to really focus on community outcome based measures to define success. So it's not just about, is it, 1 or 2 degrees cooler after X intervention in El Paso, Texas? It goes back to what we all said at the beginning of the call, which was we need to be impacting human health. And I really think that that's important because it's just really too hard, I think, for a lot of our people to imagine how to tackle this climate change beast. I see them overwhelmed. And I think Stefania said it a moment ago, people are not concerned in their immediate future about what's the policy you're making to address climate change. They're saying, I'm suffering right now. I can't pay my electric bill now. I'm sweating to death now. But at the same time, how do we communicate with that same population to help them understand that this is where we need to go and we need their support to be able to do it? Again, going back to the political situation and what really drives decision making.
Yeah, and thinking about the political situation, I do wonder, do you all think that this heat wave this year and the dramatic impacts it's been having on Texans, and as we see more of these sorts of disasters in our communities, do you think it does change the political situation in Texas at the state level? Do you think we gain some momentum on that in terms of responding or better planning for climate disasters?
Unfortunately, I think the answer to that is no. Yeah. Go ahead, Iván.
I would agree.
But I think we agree.
No, I would agree. Not only is it no, it's absolutely not. We're in medicine used to doing evidence-based, the way Nicole refers to, measuring outcomes based on impact to the person, in this case, a person's society. And so I don't think politicians are using that. My frustration with the political system, especially in Texas, besides the micromanagement of it, was a lack of empathy and understanding. And I will leave you with this thought because, Nicole and I love to talk. And I'm going to tell you this. The hottest summer to mankind, the hottest, and the politicians that are removing the mandate for rest and water breaks, that speaks volumes for itself.
Sure. Well, let's try to end on a higher note here. We've got just a couple minutes left. Are there any local or community-led initiatives that you all have been seeing in your communities? Whether in the medical system or just in the nonprofit sector, or among community groups, among neighbors, among just individuals that you think are working particularly well? You think, wow, that is probably saving lives.
I was going to say yes, and yes until you got to the end part. I will tell you this, something that's happened in, I think, the civic empowerment realm in El Paso, and some of y'all might be aware of this. We recently, it was the end of last year, there was a group of youth in our community that came together and put together a proposition to alter the charter for the city of El Paso to incorporate climate action. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that proposition failed. However, the proposition itself and the petition, I believe, had somewhere in the range of 39,000 signatures. And they were all, not all, I shouldn't say that, it was predominantly the youth of our community. And so even though the proposition didn't pass broadly, what we saw during that conversation was that this community does care about climate. They want climate action. Where there was disagreement, and I think, far be it from me as city staff to speculate about an election, but what I will say is I think that, the reason it didn't pass was that folks didn't agree with what was being proposed in terms of how to address this. But what we saw broadly, whether you were talking about business, or you were talking about those youth that were, spearheading that petition, or you were talking about the elderly that were attending community meetings to get information, everybody wants to do something about this. And that's not something, again, having been in this space for a minute, that would not have been the conversation 10 years ago. And so I think now what we see is an undeniable awareness that something is happening and that we've got to do something. And that's the beginning. That's the positive part that I want to leave you with, is that in El Paso, I am encouraged that while the conversation sometimes gets ugly and it can get very aggressive, everyone cares about this issue, and we're actually pushing funding toward it. We're starting to see this Justice 40 again coming in and saying you must focus on outcomes for humans. I think is also very important and different from the past. And so I want to leave everyone with a glimmer of hope that we can put together these initiatives, but we need community support to do it. And I think we're starting to see that now. And so I'm very optimistic in that space.
Sure. And Stefania or Dr. Meléndez, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll add something here. When Carmen Cavetza, CEER's climate justice organizer, first started with our organization, she went to Northeast Houston, started meeting with residents and talking to them about climate change. And for many people, she was their first touch point into the issue. And she told me the story about meeting with a resident who said, I don't know anything about climate change, but what I know is that our community is dying from cancer. So I think that really speaks to this need of, we really need to be looking at ways that we can address these multiple vulnerabilities that climate change is only going to continue to amplify. And something I feel really hopeful about first is mutual aid. When disasters happen, when heat waves strike, people are coming to the aid of each other. And I see that in the community. Yes. And that gives me a lot of hope, because it speaks to the empathy, the compassion, the consideration people have for one another, and the deep regard, which we really need to see on every level, from the community to our governments. We really need that compassion as a grounding force for how we're going to make it through the next several decades, as we know heat is only going to continue to worsen. But I also will say something else that gives me a lot of hope is the fact that more and more people are talking about climate change, that these conversations have become really relevant. People are seeing how it impacts them on a daily basis. And people are beginning to have more willingness to engage in these conversations and really want to see something happen. They really want to see change in their community. They're really looking forward to seeing what can happen when we all come together to work on this issue.
For sure.
And I would add my 2 cents from this perspective. This is my 37th year in medicine. It's very hard to remain hopeful. Yet all we have is hope. This week alone, the city of McAllen approved its last public space of forest and natural land for an industrial company coming in. There were people that came and protested the last space. The city of McAllen lost its last space to growth and development. COVID taught us down in the Rio Grande Valley and in the world that we need to watch out for each other, that our health does not only depend on our own predisposition and financial status, but the entire community needs to have good health, a good baseline, or our own families will be impacted. So people have come together. In my attempt to understand that for years we were the resources to guide the elected officials, they were just not listening to us. And those people who do run for elected officials, whoever it may be, that do not play the current party line, they're just not successful. I don't have to mention the people from El Paso. I don't have to mention the people from McAllen. It's just not successful. So am I hopeful? Well, you can never lose hope. But I'm also very pragmatic. And at least in the part of the country that I live at, the community itself is, I think, a lot more interested on how on $350 they're going to feed a family of 5. And they're not as interested in prevention. And certainly when I was growing up in McAllen, no one needed air conditioning. Now you have to have air conditioning. It's not an option anymore. And that's what people pay attention to, as Nicole and our panelists stated, the quality of life. And as our folks in Hidalgo County are seeing that our quality of life, how hot we are, how upset we are, how bipolar we get, how psychotic we are, that is really what's impacting. Is there hope? Yes, because youth brings hope. And so young people still have that hope and still believe. But those people that are in policy, the vast majority, their mind is not young. And so I am not pragmatic to see people that are flexible and change. We can never lose hope. But the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've seen so many signals of same old stuff, same old stuff.
Yeah.
Iván, may I? I think if I may, I'd like to, I hope that what I'm about to say re-encourages your hope. So 10 years ago, I was a practicing architect in the private sector, and I was working in the environmental space, just as an advocate. And 10 years ago, I decided that the only way I was going to be able to affect real change within the system was to get in it. And I gave up 12 years of architecture practice, and I became the world's first Latina chief resilience officer. And in the last 10 years, I have tried to remain young in my mind. I have tried to affect as much change as I can from within. But I think you make the fantastic point, is that we cannot do this alone. There are a lot of really good people, whether it's in government, the nonprofit sector, et cetera, that are really trying, but we need people to pay attention, and we need people to engage and understand and work with us to achieve these goals. And until we do that, when we try to continue to implement solutions upon people, we're going to continue to fail. We have to implement solutions with people. And I hope that gives you an additional ounce of hope to hear that story.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to leave off. And I just want to thank all three of you so much for joining us for this conversation. It was super fascinating, very important work that all three of you are doing on extreme heat in Texas and in 3 very different communities. So really appreciate your time. And to our viewers,
one more
thing. Joining us.
Yeah, I'm so sorry you're trying to close it out. I just wanted to tell you, just for everybody, for context, when we started this conversation, it was 92 degrees. I'm doing this outside. And as of right now, it is 98 degrees. So in the time that we've been talking, it has gone up 6 degrees, just where I'm sitting, and I'm in the shade. So I leave you with that. Apologies for interrupting.
Well, I hope you get some cooler weather soon, although I don't know that it's in the forecast at the moment, unfortunately. But again, I just want to thank all three of you for being here, and to our viewers, we really appreciate all of you for tuning in and, listening to this important conversation about how extreme heat is affecting communities across Texas, and some of the thought leaders who are thinking about what we can do to address those vulnerabilities. So thank you all.
This conversation was really interesting to me. Erin is going to be joining us here shortly to help answer questions, and Matt has got some questions that were submitted previously, and we're happy to take questions from anyone in the audience. If we're not able to answer them, we hopefully can point you in the right direction. And just selfishly as an editor, I'm going to be listening to what you guys are interested in the Tribune writing about. I think listening to people in the audience can really help direct our coverage, because we don't have all the answers, but we have really good journalists who are very good at getting answers for you. So let me, we've got Erin here behind me. She's the subject matter expert, and I'm going to be kind of emceeing here. So feel free to ask any questions you have. And Matt, I don't know if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I'll kick us off. Thanks, Dave. Dylan had submitted a question. Phoenix now has a permanent Office of Heat Response and Mitigation to, quote, fight the growing hazard of urban heat. Dylan's question, what are county and municipal governments in Texas doing to mitigate heat even when there is not a declared heat emergency?
And that's a great question. And Erin, I think you talked about this a little bit during the panel discussion. what cities are doing. And I also want to, the coverage that you did last year when we were in a really bad drought, you did some reporting about cooling centers around the state. So you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for the question, and for everyone for tuning in and attending. I would say what county and municipal governments are doing. We heard Nicole talk a little bit about that during the panel, but it really varies. It's difficult to get resources to cities and municipalities for a heat event, just because there's not that sort of emergency disaster declared like there is for other types of extreme weather events. But some cities do have heat emergency plans. Like I know the city of Houston has a heat emergency plan that they activate when they reach a certain threshold. And then I was also just seeing that the U.S. Conference of Mayors are supporting legislation in Congress that would actually add extreme heat to the definition of major disasters under FEMA. And so those are some interesting ideas that have been discussed in the political realm. And then I would say on the ground, some of the more common things that are going on in terms of responding to heat have been, yes, the cooling centers that get opened. But, as we discussed during the panel, one of the problems with the cooling centers is just, it's not integrated into people's lives very well. A lot of people don't want to go to a cooling center. They'd rather stay at home. They'd rather find a fan and try to cool their own home down. So it's not a perfect solution. It can be helpful for people who are unhoused, although again, there's some challenges even with that. Other interesting things I've seen across the state, I've seen some local governments who are trying to get either free or greatly reduced air conditioners or HVAC assistance to their communities. And so that can be helpful. Just, we saw in West Texas, some people who had West and South Texas, some people who had problems or had even died. The reason was because they hadn't yet had their air conditioner fixed. And part of the concern was financial. And so to the extent that local governments can help get some of that financial assistance for some what is really life-saving equipment during heat emergencies, I think that is one thing that they've been doing in some areas of the state.
So there's a great question from Michelle that uses the example of Florida, where a number of Republican-leaning mayors have begun to discuss climate emergency issues, and that they haven't been at this long. But Michelle wonders, what they've learned, what works, doesn't work for cities that are trying to collaborate. So if, as Michelle states, if that action isn't happening at the state level, what are mayors doing to fill that gap?
Yeah, I think that, there's a group of climate mayors. I don't know, maybe some people in the audience have heard of this, but it's basically a network coalition of mayors across the U.S. that are supporting one another in climate action at the local level. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner is actually the chair of that group, and Houston has a climate action plan for its city operations, like a lot of other major cities in Texas. Several cities also have a resilience plan to address the impacts of climate change. I think that these plans are helpful. They can set an example and an intention for a community in the city for businesses, but it actually doesn't require a lot from local businesses in the community. It doesn't require a lot from the economy-wide scale. And so I think when cities have actually sought to reach beyond their own operations into the larger economy of their city, Republicans at the state level have generally responded by siphoning away local control from the cities and giving it to the state. We saw that happen during this legislative session. So that doesn't really appear to be an avenue right now in Texas. We also heard Nicole talk about some of that local control stuff on the panel, but a couple of bills that passed this session will essentially block cities from adopting ordinances that prohibit engines based on their fuel source. And that was in direct response to a proposal in Dallas that would have restricted purchases of gas-powered lawn equipment. And so that, inspired that legislation. And then There was another very targeted piece of legislation, Senate Bill 1860, that targeted a proposed climate charter in El Paso, which I also think we discussed on the panel. But that charter was voted down. But even so, the state passed some legislation to make sure that no other city could try to attempt that. So yeah, I think there's some things that locals can do, but often when they try to reach beyond the very narrow set of their own operations, we see that kind of backlash at the state level.
So we have time for a couple more questions, and Erin, in the panel conversation, there was reference to learning from methods, tactics that may be effective but may not, and the question of how do you learn from that and move forward. Carol asks, are cool roofs helpful, and should they be required as part of a building code? What kind of conversations are there going on right now?
Yeah, I would say what I know about cool roofs are that they reduce energy use by reflecting heat and sunlight, and so that helps cool things down. It lowers air conditioning costs. I do believe that Houston and the city of Austin have cool roof codes or ordinances on the books. Houston requires cool roofs for new commercial buildings, but I haven't seen anything discussed statewide. So maybe that's another avenue for locals to really affect changes through things like that, through policies like that.
One last invitation for anyone in our audience who may want to ask a question. Oh, good, we have one.
Hi, my name is Larry Lindenschmidt. I'm with the Hill Country Institute and Citizens Climate Lobby. I really appreciate the Trib's efforts to bring information to us and really encourage people. And I'm glad to hear Ending on Hope. And I really find that we need that. I worked in the session this year and I came away very disturbed. And so it's good to be encouraged. So my question is really, how do you think, with the information that the three panelists and you're finding as a reporter, how can we use that to impact what the legislature sees, what they think, and ultimately what they do, and a lot of what they maybe don't do? So how do you translate this into something that works? Because I know there are a lot of us, like Adrian Shelley, who's here today, and the folks from Sierra Club. There's a lot of people really working hard and diligently and wisely, but it's a difficult uphill battle. So how do you gather that information and put it in something that we can all gather around, testify on, and make sense of and have an impact? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that the panelists, when I asked them about whether they thought that this particular heat event would translate to some sort of political momentum, they said no. I don't know if I agree with that completely. I think that I've seen a lot of political momentum around the OSHA and worker rules protections, around heat ordinances, and I think we probably will see very soon some federal action on that. And so I think it really depends on the moment and sort of what catches fire politically. But there was some significant climate and environment legislation passed last session, particularly around water, boosting water supplies and preventing flooding. Some money that was going to be allocated towards that. The state parks investments to buy more land for state parks. We saw some reform at TCEQ to increase penalties on companies that pollute. And so I think that while it's easy to see a lot of legislation that is not going to mitigate climate change, there's also some legislation that was passed that particularly on the adaptation side of climate change, that I think the state and the state's Republican leaders are more willing to engage with. And so I am curious to see whether we will see some of that in response to heat as this situation continues to get worse.
Thanks, Erin. And I think with that, I'd just like to thank Dave Harmon for joining us today. Erin, thank you for moderating this event. Those of us gathered here in person and online appreciate your being with us, and please do stay tuned to Erin's continued coverage on climate issues and the larger work of Dave's team. So thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to stick around, and if anyone wants to talk about our coverage or what we should be covering, I'm right here and I'm taking notes. Thank you.